Hi, I'm Corey May, World Director at Haven Entertainment, and welcome to Game Maker's Notebook. I'm your host for today's episode. I'm here with Graham Parks, Creative Director and Writer, and Oliver Lewin, Game Director and Composer at Goodbye World Games. We're here to talk today about Before Your Eyes. We're going to go through their journey going from school project to full release, the evolution of the blinking mechanic that's so central to the experience, and then a pretty spoiler-filled discussion of the game's incredible story. We hope you enjoy the chat. Hi, I am Corey May. I'm here today with Oliver Lewin and Graham Parks, two of the people behind a game that is very near and dear to my heart that I loved very much called Before Your Eyes. And just wanted to chat with the two of you today a bit, learn a little bit more about you, your company, the game, and then eventually we'll probably get to a point where I'll give spoiler warnings to the people that are listening at home, so that we can dig into some of the more interesting and intriguing bits about the game. So I guess I wanted to just start out by having the two of you tell me your stories. Like, where did you come from? All that good stuff.
Yeah, I've actually known this guy here since we were neighbors when we were 3 years old. So this is a friendship that goes back many years. So we've been friends forever. And then the third sort of lead on the project, who's not on this, Will Hellworth. I went to middle school with him, so I met him at around 12. So it's the core group of us who are childhood friends, and always big gamers, and always sort of we were kind of halfway between film kids and gamer kids. We worked at a local movie theater, like repertoire. We were the kind of pretentious movie kids, but we were also obsessed with video games. Will went to USC to study games. I went to NYU to study playwriting. I ended up minoring in game design. And Ollie studied music because he's our producer and co-director, but he's also the composer for all the music in the game. So we've known each other forever. And this project started actually as Will, who's not on this call, his senior project at USC. And he kind of brought us both in to me to write and Ollie to write music for it. And that's kind of when this whole thing started at the end of 2014.
So that actually raises another question for me, at least. There were multiple iterations of this game. It sounds like it started out as a project and then evolved. And so I'd be really curious to know sort of how it went from that to what we all played last year.
I think in terms of that kind of history of it, like Graham was saying, it started as a student project through Will having this kind of like kernel of the idea for it and developing it at USC. And then he brought on Graham and then me as kind of friend collaborators. And that student project, it went to Indiecade and got some awards there, and it went to IGF. I think it got like the student award at IGF. That was in 2014, 2015. And then after that, there was a kind of decision to do a Kickstarter. And it was like, okay, like let's do this for real, and we'll do the Kickstarter, or what we thought was for real. And then we did the Kickstarter era in 2016, which was like a lot of like trial by fire kind of situation. So we learned a lot during that. And then we secured actual funding to kind of take it to, I would describe like, I guess I would say a legitimate place in 2018, at the end of 2018. And that's when some of us like on the team were like, okay, we can actually work on this and it not just be like weekends and nights. Like we can actually set aside time and work on it like a job. And in 2020, I shouldn't have even set myself up with all these dates, because now it's like the expectations. There's even dates in 2020 on April. So then we got the rest of the funding that we needed came from Skybound Games, who published the game. And so, the original game that went to IGF and Indiecade was called Close Your. And that kind of went through all these iterations, and Graham wrote like 10 versions of the script. And then we got to Before Your Eyes. It's almost like we talk about it sometimes, like there was a short film that we made back in 2014. And then ultimately it kind of like turned into the feature length. And that's what came out in 2021 with Skybound.
Yeah, so I'd be curious, when you look at from going from Close Your to Before Your Eyes, how how big was the experience? How similar is it to what shipped? To me, it's always really interesting to think about how a game begins or how a game, is initially prototyped versus what releases. And I'd just be really curious to know, how it evolved, what it was like
Yeah,
then
I
versus
mean,
now.
there's not a single like shared, from that first version of the game, there's not like a single shared asset, piece of dialogue,
Okay.
anything really. Really, what they share is the most basic concept, and that was really what we started with, what Will came in with, which was this idea that we can use webcams to track your eyes. And I think that he was playing like at the time those kind of first Blendo games were coming out, like 30 Flights of Loving and Gravity's Bone. Those are big influences on all of us. And it was this idea of bringing the cut into games. It was the first time that like it felt like game makers were bringing some of that cinematic language over. And he kind of realized that with what eye tracking can do, that we can kind of take it one step further and actually offload the cut to the player and actually use the blink to do the cut. And so that's really what we started with. Very quickly as we started talking about it, me with the film background, that got me so excited because it felt such like this amazing fusing of those two languages. And very quickly we kind of went, well, let's do something where its life goes by in the blink of an eye. The idea of doing a whole life story, so you're blinking through someone's entire life. That very early on, as soon as he kind of said, let's do something with this tech, that very early on, we all glommed onto. It's like we want to look at a life from beginning to end. And then those things stayed the same through every single iteration, but it was almost like completely new. So it was a student project, so the team was completely different, and we built that first version of it. And if you look back at that stuff, there was no VO; it was all text. The graphics were very rudimentary. It very much looked and felt like a student project. I mean, we have up on our social media as like the early trailer, and it is funny for us to watch because it was really like it's pretty janky in places, but there was something about that concept that very clearly when you put that in front of players, that jumping and using the tech in that way, just even when I think the writing was pretty, I think that all the tech was pretty rudimentary. I can speak for myself in saying that my writing wasn't very good at that point while I was in college. Like it was very pretentious and going for things that maybe I didn't really know about, just like what college kid writing normally is. And all these things about it were rough, but every time that we built it, it would still get this really amazing emotional reaction. And I think that we just kept seeing that there was clearly something here, and kept feeling like, wow, if it's working this well at this level, well, how well could it work at the next level? And that kind of kept pushing us to, also then taking it to festivals, to Indiecade. So it was like after that student project went to Indiecade and won the developer's choice there, then it was suddenly, okay, let's all do a bunch of more work and almost make a whole new thing that we then took to the IGF. And then that won the student award at the IGF. And so almost at every step, it was like we went, okay, let's throw out everything and then let's use this as an opportunity to start again and do it right this time. And I think there's like, there really were like 3 or 4 full kind of different iterations, though every iteration up until this last one, until we really had this funding, were much shorter. They were like 15 to 20 minutes, maybe tops like 30 minutes of play. And so once we had this actual financing, well, from the Kickstarter, we went, okay, we want to make this an actual like movie length experience that's a more full thing that you could actually sell. So yeah, it really is that short film being adapted into a feature film kind of thing.
And so it's so interesting to me. I spent most of my career working on big unwieldy AAA games, and the idea of being able to ship something that's not the first draft is so foreign to me, and I'm very jealous. So I'm curious, when you decided, like, what was the process of deciding to take it to Kickstarter? Was this sort of moment where you sat down together and asked yourselves, do we try and take this further? Like, were there people that you went to sort of talk to you about, like, what came next? Like, how did you arrive at the decision to really make that transition, I guess, from short film to feature?
I think, this would be a key Will question, because I think that was him largely. And I think at USC at the time, I didn't go to USC, but sort of speaking from observation, there was a little bit of like a pipeline of like, oh, your indie game, like your student game did kind of well, like, and there were a lot of Kickstarters at that time for these kinds of indie games. So I think that it was sort of like, I think that people I think that Will felt like, oh yeah, this received enough sort of compliments that justified going further with it.
But there was a
Yeah, and like
large
Graham said,
there was a large gap between like that
yeah,
IGF
there's about
build
a
and then
year.
going to Kickstarter.
Yeah,
Um, and I think it
because
was
the
something that
Kickstarter was in the
yeah.
summer of 2016. Yeah, so there was like a gap.
And so were you still working on the game during that gap, or had you gone off to do other stuff and
It's
then
so
you got a
crazy. It's
call
hard
one
to
night that
remember.
was like, let's get back into it?
We were always kind of like meeting up on it and talking about it, but I can remember kind of going to Will and being like, hey, we should do this. Like, this is an opportunity. And I remember me and Will like we're batting it around, but back and forth for a while. I remember during that year off. And Ollie and I worked on a short film that went to South by Southwest. And I think it was after that, right after that we did the Kickstarter. I think it was just us kind of going, well, we have this thing, and I don't know. It was that belief in going, wow, if a version that was that kind of rushed, and if especially when you're young, like especially in college and then right out of college, like you feel like you're growing so much. Like a year, you feel like every year, if you feel like this totally different person that has this totally different skill set, that's like, oh man, who I was as a writer, who I was as a game maker, as a composer a year ago was, if I'm so much better now. I think that kind of levels out the older you get. But I think there was this feeling of going, wow, if it did that well, then if we just had a little money and a little more time and our current skill sets, we could make something amazing. And yeah, it was just kind of taking the plunge. I think very soon after doing it, we realized how kind of we were still really stupid. Basically, like we kickstarted it for way too little money. We promised way too much. We really were that classic failed Kickstarter of a bunch of idiotic kids over promising and then not being
It was
able
like
to deliver.
that's like, honestly, that's like an intense thing to go through at that age, like right out of college, to like feel like, oh, we're Kickstarter failures. Because yeah, you like Graham said, you're like, oh my god, dude, we just bagged $25,000. Like, we can make the world's best game, and it's so ignorant. And then you start having these emotions of like, we're failures, we're letting down like thousands of people. Like it's kind of like a rough thing, and we didn't know if we'd make it out of it, but we did make a game ultimately.
What was that process like? So it started out, you were super psyched, you had what you thought you needed, everything was wonderful, and then what was the sort of first, I don't know, sign that maybe you needed to have asked for more?
Yeah, I think it just was
like, was there a moment?
Yeah, I mean, pretty quickly, I think we just realized that, like, it was that kind of just like jump first and sort of figure it out as we go. And it was a kind of just a sort of a blind jump from a cliff. And we're really happy that we made that jump. Ultimately, it is sort of like we needed that. To make an indie game is not really an advisable pursuit, especially one that is narrative focused and experimental and weird and uses weird new tech that isn't tested, and all the things about it were like bad ideas. So if we weren't kind of, if we were thinking too much, we wouldn't have done it. And I think that we're all really happy that we did, though there definitely were years where we realized, holy shit, like, I think it was also this problem of no one could be full time. So everybody had other gigs. Everyone was pursuing other careers. And we're all childhood friends. Like the lead artist, Griffin, was our other really, who did an amazing work on the game, but is our other really close childhood friend. So there's a lot of like, it's sort of like, we compare it a lot to like a band, and in the ways that that's great and the ways that that can be not great. And that like, that, we all know each other so well that that's what leads to such great creative collaboration. But it can also lead to a kind of like, well, you're not doing any work, or you took this whole week to do that thing, so I don't want to do that thing. And it led to infighting when we kind of realized, oh, we're in over our heads. We don't really have the infrastructure for this. It very quickly, it was, oh, this went from being this like fun student project that we all get to collaborate from. In that time in life, when you're in college, you don't have other pressures. You're not trying to make rent. You're just kind of there. Then to suddenly it's this nights and weekends commitment. And suddenly it just, it just didn't, we very quickly kind of realized that it's easy to say, yeah, we'll commit it and we'll kill it overnights and weekends, and we're gonna do this thing. And it's another thing to actually, while juggling everything else that life throws your way, actually do it.
I feel like there's also like a threshold when you're making something, when you're kind of and you're at a stage where you're going to test, and there's a point where you're actually excited to get the feedback, because you're like, I want to know if people like this and if like how they're going to react to it. Well, and then there's a lot of times where you're about to test something, but you're like, I already know what they're going to say. I already know how I want to do this differently. And we were always there. It wasn't until that next iteration where we started to kind of like button up and treat it more like a job that we ever got to a stage where we're like, wait, we want to test this. Now we've actually executed something the way we envisioned it.
And so you went through the Kickstarter process. It wasn't quite enough. And so what was the next step then? Did you reach a point where you figured we need to find either more money or we need to link up with people that, okay. So I'd be interested just to hear about that transition.
Yeah, it was kind of, it was honestly kind of like, it was getting to that place where, everybody's other commitments and stuff were taking so much time, just kind of getting, just kind of slowly chipping away at it when we all could, realizing, slowly, and a certain amount of, I think, despair starts to creep in over the team. I feel like Ollie and I are very intent to talk openly about this in case there's anyone out there who's as stupid or foolish as we were, of knowing that, like, just speaking openly to that there is that thing of going, well, this was the student project, had all this promise, people got excited about it on Kickstarter and funded it, and then kind of going, oh man, we don't actually know how to do this. We did start kind of feeling around for investment and realizing that wasn't something that we really knew how to do. I mean, we had early conversations with a few investors and a few publishers that didn't really go anywhere after the student project. But we kind of got lucky with a company called Riot, RYOT. They're like a subsidiary of Verizon. They were really focused more on VR, documentary, AR stuff, not as much game in the game space. But I had taken a meeting over there for something unrelated, and it turns out that they were fans of the project, and it was just one of those kind of really lucky things where it turns out they had known about the project and read about it, because it kind of made it, even earlier versions of the project made some splash on like Kotaku and Killscreen and certain things, so people who were had read those stuff knew about it, and we just started talking. We met a producer over there named Jake Sally, who I think was really instrumental to kind of helping us see that, oh man, there could be a bigger version of this thing, and kind of opening our eyes up to taking on investment. And yeah, it just kind of happened really organically. That step of us kind of going, wow, there's this company that really would be willing to put this investment in, and this would give us a chance to really right the wrongs of the past and actually kind of take the proper stab at this thing that we've never been able to take because we just haven't had the time or the money. So it kind of just came together that way.
And then what happened post the sort of investment from Riot? Because you also went out and found publishing as well, right? That
came later. The Skybound journey came later, and that really was the next essential part of it. Once we had go ahead, Ollie.
I mean, I think to me, like the most sort of standout thing in terms of like your question is team building. Like we really knew like where our gaps were and what we needed on the team. So it was enough money to kind of think more logically about where all that money would go. And we knew we needed a kind of like a lead programmer, lead designer injection of new ideas into the project.
How big was the team at the time that you met with Riot versus how it started growing post that?
I mean, again, we were very part-time.
Yeah, there were at that point, there were really like 4 of us who were just still like really attached, like 4 or 5 of us who had just like remained attached. And then so soon after getting the money, we hired Bella Messick, who's our kind of lead designer, lead programmer, just really was like the shake it up kind of new blood we needed. And that kind of got us off to the races. We tried to like really apply a little more maturity to like making schedules, figuring out the deliverables, like doing alpha, doing beta, things like that. And we got it to a good place. But we also started learning about the way that the industry actually functioned and what publishers did as opposed to just an investor. And that's how we started kind of looking out for publishers. And we also at that time really, that was a learning process too. And we realized, okay, actually we need a bit more money to really execute this the way that we really want to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it was at every step. Yeah, kind of like it was kind of like learning by doing or learning by failing is kind of, I think, the underlying thesis statement of the process of making Before Your Eyes was sort of learning through failure and then picking yourself up and going, okay, so clearly you can't get it done that way. What's the way? That's the right way to get it done. But I mean, going back a little bit from there, I think one of the things that the investment also allowed was like. For the first time, we kind of really could like scope a project. And I think this is so essential because when you're trying to work, we really genuinely, when we did that Kickstarter, we really genuinely thought like, okay, we will make this happen on nights and weekends. But the problem with that kind of commitment to something is that it's so easy to kind of be overly optimistic about what your schedule is going to allow for. And I think that once we actually had a budget and a sense of, okay, we have given these people a contractual deadline and we are all actually kind of working full time on this thing, suddenly, you stop you're able to actually look at it and figure out scope and have those conversations in a real way. And it was so important for us. One thing was just the financial help, but also just the structure that provided, having somebody, having some sense of a producer that is, on you. People complain about the money people or that, oh, we just want to be creative, but like it really, it's so important, I think, as a creative to have some sense of structure. If you're just alone and it's completely on you to do it, it's so hard to not let it overscope or not let it just go for, push and push. One thing that getting the Riot investment really helped with was that we were able to, because we were so, at that point, we were so shrunk, we didn't have, everyone else was working other jobs, everyone was doing different things. So I got to have time to basically start first as the writer, and basically just for 2 or 3 months, for like 3 or 4, maybe 5 months, it was basically just like me working full-time writing and working with Will and Ollie just on the script and not building anything in Unity. We had built so much stuff. We had learned so much about what the game was. But I think that's again, another place where our kind of very weird, unprofessional, way of making a game actually resulted in something that I imagine, as a games writer, you never really get, which is like that time when it's not a sense of a production timeline and it's not a sense of everyone's working, we need this by tomorrow, but just real time to just do story development, just do script development. And I had all great partners in Ollie and Will, where it'd be like, a couple times a week or every week, they'd read pages, we'd go back and forth, we'd get on phone calls, we'd meet up in person, talk, I'd go off and write, we'd come back together. And we really were able to like write this script. And then so when we started hiring up those other people, like Ollie mentioned, Bella Messick, who really came on and kind of really helped the project, Richard Beer, our engineer, who's an amazing help, Dylan, Terry, our sound lead, all these people started joining on, all our great artists started joining on. But we had that time to just almost in a vacuum, like figure out the story we were telling. And that was such a blessing, I think, for what the game ultimately ended up becoming.
I do have a quick question actually about that. I'd be curious, because I feel like it's different for everyone, what your writing process was like. Were you doing it in Final Draft? Were you doing it in another program? Were there what's the word? Were you thinking about the mechanics as you went, or were you really tackling it from a purely narrative standpoint at that moment?
Yeah, a bit of. I mean, all through all the different versions, we tried all sorts of different ways. There were lots of versions that were more interactive, had more branching in them. So I used to prototype things or actually write full scripts in Twine. I also did other writing in Final Draft, and that would be like my more kind of like native or more comfortable place. So then when it came to doing that full draft, I was very much like, I don't want to keep messing with Twine. I don't want to keep messing with. I want to just do it in a way that is like most comfortable to me, because Twine's an amazing tool, but it becomes it can very quickly, if you're not organized like me, it can become this, it can become a big mess. I don't know how much you've played with some of that kind of stuff, but you really have to be on it. And I wanted to pare down some of the branching and all that kind of stuff. That got even more pared down as we got into production, and we kind of realized. But yeah, I just did it in final draft, and I was always trying to think to, I'm not interested in writing games. If I'm trying to work in games, it's because I'm interested in what games can do, and that was always what really attracted me to this project. Was it felt like it could be very much a story game that though it couldn't work as well in any other genre, and that's the only kind of game I'd be interested in writing, is something where the gameness of it is inextricably tied to what makes it great. So I'm always thinking about the interactions and the play experience. And because I had Will and Ollie, I always had, those collaborators looking at it, and Will go, and that push and pull. So it wouldn't be just me writing a story and not thinking about the gameplay. Though, I will say that I had written something that once we brought on Bella, we had a great story. And a lot of what that process then became, once we had that script that we knew we liked the story on, was that push and pull with the interaction and the design. And I had tried my best, but I'm not a designer. So then it did come, Bella is a very confident designer, coming in and kind of pulling that script apart a little bit, and finding places where it was too much of just a movie, and finding places to let the interaction lead a little bit more. And that was a really great process.
So I guess the other stuff I want to start getting into at this point, I think it's still safe and not too spoilery, is the blinking is so core, like you're saying, to the entire experience. And I'm just curious to sort of know the history behind it. Was that the very first thing from day one? Was it this idea of like, we want to create an experience that is driven through this, act of blinking?
100%.
Okay.
Yeah. That's very much the kind of, that was the one thing, as I said, that never changed. That was okay. Will's kind of brain blast, and the kind of thing that brought us all together was this fascination with blinking, and the idea of blinking through somebody's life, the idea of light flashing before your eyes and using eye detection to make it so you're trying to hold your eyes open and you can't, and you blink and you jump forward. And it was a lot about that the kind of, the way that's a kind of, most games are about empowerment, and that most mechanics seem to be about empowering a player. And I think that what was subversive about it, which always excited us, was this was fundamentally about, taking power away and forcing the player to sort of submit themselves to the inevitable, because you can only fight a blink for so long. And that metaphor just always felt for all of us, always felt so juicy, and like, and again, it's like it was always a great idea, and it took so long to like actually, drill all the way down into it. And I think we always felt like, God, there's more here, because there's something so, inherently sort of juicy and evocative about that metaphor. So yeah, the blink thing, blinking through someone's life, trying to hold on to a memory, and you blink too soon, you jump to the next. That was the one thing that every single version, and that was always going back to, how do we maximize that? How do we underline that in the best way?
It's interesting that you bring that up, because when I was playing through it, I experienced that tension. And so I guess, because initially my question was going to be, did you put some of those things in on purpose to sort of create that tension between, do I try and force my eyes open, or do I blink? And it was even in smaller moments. I remember as a child, like trying to use the boat to pop all the clouds, same thing in the bathtub. And so I was like, they're building these things in, and sometimes, more, you would get the metronome, but then you would also see there's more things to do in the space potentially. And it's just really interesting to hear you talk about the philosophy embracing that conflict, because I know that I experienced this idea of like, do I struggle? Do I surrender? What's the right thing to do? There were a couple of times where I must have blinked, even though I was trying to fight it back, and I moved along, and I was like, this is tough, but this feels real. And so I agree. There was a lot of power there. It really felt like it was being true to life. And so I don't know. I guess I'm just taking a moment to say I really appreciate it. I am curious if there were conversations though during the development about like, what should the rules be behind blinking? Are there rules? Did things evolve or change as you played with the game? Did you initially want to just, I don't know, increase that tension, decrease that tension? What were those discussions like around the
Yeah, I
design
mean,
of it?
that was the kind of ongoing, never-ending discussion, and I think, you know, we all really recognize that most of the games that we loved and played a lot of were kind of like these control fantasies where, in terms of the pacing, you know, you're in your level and you have a lot of control over, you know, exploiting that environment and getting what you need there. But the reality of life is that it really does like wash over you, and how you handle that emotionally is the big question. And so I think we always knew we wanted it to have that montage feeling of life passing too fast. But the finding the sweet spot emotionally of like how fast is too fast was a really, really long journey for us. And I think that for a long time, what we were seeing from the playtesting was that we were kind of being too um too intense. Like, I almost want to say like sadistic or something, because like people were just like, damn, that was really frustrating, like I missed everything. And it's like, well, you want it to be bittersweet, you don't want it to be like really frustrating. And so we just kept on trying to find ways to find that sweet spot. And one of the things that Bella really introduced was this idea of a threshold, which ultimately, like, that led to that kind of UI element of the metronome kind of coming up at a certain point in every scene. And after that point, your blink takes you to the next level. And I think that that kind of introduced this section, ladder section of each scene, where you feel like, oh, okay, anything here is sort of bonus, or I can be proud of myself, but I know it's gonna be fleeting and it's gonna disappear soon. Graham really played a lot with that in the writing too, and with the actors, of
Yeah.
sort of saying, okay, after a certain point, ad lib and just keep going, because there's so much stuff in there that it's like less than 1% of the players are gonna get to see, but we really wanted it in there.
Yeah, we
Does
wanted
that
to
mean
always
that?
have. Go ahead.
No, you first. Go for it.
Oh, sorry. No, just that we always, as he said, always trying to design it so that there was something to try to hold your eyes. Like, we always wanted you to feel, or most scenes, we did want you to have that experience you're describing, where you're going to have some version of, maybe I missed something. And we wanted a little bit of that sense of regret, almost baked into every single scene if we could.
Does that mean that once upon a time there was no metronome and you could just blink your way all the way
Yeah.
through?
Bingo. Yeah. And Bella was
that's really interesting.
Yeah. And that worked, I think, in the smaller versions a little better, because it was this sort of just this crazy blast of experience, and you would just sort of sit down and blink through someone's whole life and go, what, but that worked, in a festival environment. Maybe you sit down in front of this thing and just have this 15-minute thing. But once it came to, we're designing this whole thing, it took so much control away. And I think that's a thing that it's always really hard in writing. I think sometimes about like, that difference between ambiguity and lack of clarity or something like that. Like, a lot of like young writers, I've done some teaching of writing, and I feel like a lot of young writers, they want their stories to not be too obvious. And they think, I want it to be sort of ambiguous, but they often early on, when you try to be ambiguous, it ends up just being unclear and confusing. And I think that was like the problem we had for a long time, where it was like, well, we want this game to be frustrating in the way life is frustrating, in the fact that you can't hold on to every single moment. And we want, I think it's important to us that we're interested in exploring mechanics that aren't just fun. We're interested in exploring mechanics, but there's that line between that it's sort of about that feeling of frustration, but still not that it's frustrating because I think that they're just bad designers and that this was just a mistake that I jumped through the scene. And it was so hard to find that thing of something where it felt like, yes, it's frustrating, but it was clear that it was intentionally frustrating. And that's really what bringing that metronome up in the scene, kind of that really clicked for us, because I was able to write a scene before that comes out, not worrying about, is the player going to miss this or not? Get all the important information across to know that they're going to feel like they're in good hands. They're not going to be confused about who's who, or, I jumped out of the scene before I even understood at all what was happening in it, that's just bad frustrating. That's not interesting frustrating. And then once that metronome came up, then suddenly now everything that we can put on that other side can still be fascinating and can build out the world. It can really make you want to stay. And then you're going to be frustrated when you blink, but you're going to know that that frustration is part of the experience because we put that metronome there, and you feel like you're in good hands. And it took a long time to kind of finally figure out how to get what our intention was, which was the kind of good frustrating, and separate that from the unintentional frustrating, which is
Yeah,
what we
a lot
were
of that I
thinking
feel
for a
like
lot of years.
a lot of that I feel like is sort of front loading the content that is must see content, and that's Graham in the dialogue, and it's also the art in terms of the visual storytelling and the environment, and it's the music and it's the audio, and I think that it's a lot of the interactions too. And I think once we figured out that formula of kind of front loading the content that was must see, and then as the scene goes on, it becomes more and more like getting into bonus territory and then getting into like ad-libbing territory, where there's certain things where I think like the creators and the people that localized the subtitles are like the only people who have ever heard some of these things, but we definitely like had fun with that bonus territory. It makes me think about that thing in Oblivion where there's like someone found this one NPC that says like, wait, hold on, let me do that take again. And like there's like almost stuff like that.
Well, yeah. I mean, and VO is the easiest thing because when we realized with the scope, we wanted to have a game that had tons of content you can miss. But when it comes to actually properly scoping a game, you realize, okay, it's pretty hard to put a bunch of interactions that you're going to maybe blink through, a lot of things like that. But VO, especially if you have great, actors who can ad lib the way that we did, putting in a 2-minute, 3-minute VO clip versus a 30-second VO clip takes about the same amount of time, especially because we designed a lot of the scenes so that you didn't always see the characters. Sometimes they're behind you, they're in the other room. That was very intentional because we knew, okay, we can then just throw a really long VO clip in there. And if it's interesting enough dialogue, the player is going to want to listen to it. And it's a kind of very cost-effective way to give that effect that we always wanted the game to have.
I have other questions about the blinking, but it starts to venture into spoiler territory. So I'll save it for when we talk about the spoilery stuff later, because I think you do some really interesting things, and I'm assuming it's intentional with what you can blink away from versus what you then can't blink away from later. But I'll save it for a little bit further down the road, just in case people haven't played through yet. I'm curious with the blinking, and this is a maybe more, I don't know, technical or practical question. Were there issues or surprises along the way with the technology, with the mechanic, things that you were pleasantly surprised by, things that, were a source of frustration, challenges that you had to overcome in terms of just making it work? I know there's some calibration at the beginning. I'm just curious about what that was like getting the blinking to actually function as an input.
Yeah, that was a huge, massive part of the whole development process. There's so many variables that Rich, our lead engineer, had to account for, and also had to design very kind of specific testing protocols for. The sun setting mid playthrough, weird webcams from the dark web, like people using avatar like apps, VTuber apps concurrently in the background. There's just an endless list of variables. And so Rich just tweaked endlessly, trying to kind of get the best kind of baseline scenario for all these variables of lighting and environmental variables. And then kind of we created this calibration scene in the beginning so that it would sort of tailor it to different people's scenarios. And we, it came a really, really long way because we were always kind of monitoring how that would go. But, there were curveballs like up until the very last day. People, once the pandemic came about, it was like, what's going to happen if someone's wearing a mask? Graham kind of always reminds us about how like testing even became harder during the pandemic because webcams were like sold out everywhere because everyone wanted to like suddenly be streaming. And so that was, there were so many kind of things to overcome. And the pandemic was actually a good thing in one tiny way. Hope that doesn't come off disrespectfully, which is that it forced us to do a lot more testing from home and that actually, we realized there were a lot of variables that we weren't controlling for, of like, oh yeah, someone's in their room has like really crazy lights behind them, and just figuring out all these different things like that. And then when we launched, we have this little thing, we created this thing for streamers so that you can see your face on the screen while you're playing. And that's when we learned that streamers were pretty particular about how their video feed looks, and everybody was complaining, it's slightly warped, it's slightly warped. So everything with dealing with the camera was a lot of like uncharted waters, and there wasn't literature online or other people who had tested for this stuff. So we really had to kind of do a lot from scratch, and there wasn't a playbook for it. But definitely, like, hats off to Rich, because he never gave up and just kept tweaking it forever on these little variables of all these little points on the face that determines what a blink is and what it isn't, like, so that a twitch or a smile or turning your head or walking away, that none of those things are registered as a blink.
Yeah, I'm curious. It's actually, you bring up a couple of interesting points. There are no other, at least that I can think of. Maybe you found them during development. Are there other games that have ever attempted to use the camera in the way that you have, that you could at least look to for learnings, or was this truly uncharted?
Maybe one or two, but not very commercial ones. Like, still pretty experimental things.
Yeah, I mean, we like, like, Discord is such a resource for connecting with other devs, and we would be looking for people who had experience, like, using the same plugins that we were using, for instance. And this one guy who really came in very clutch and helped us out late in the game, he was in Germany, and he had a little app that he made on his own, which was like a VTuber app, so you could have like an anime avatar if you're streaming it. His app's really successful. He helped us out. And so a lot of the things we were looking at would be like, face filters and people working in that space.
That's really interesting. And then you raised something that I guess I didn't even think of, is some portion of this game was developed during the pandemic. I guess that most of your team was relatively distributed beforehand. So was there a big change in the same way that, we all had to, I went home from an office in March and I still haven't gone back.
Well, yeah. We would go off and on, but like, because most of us are in LA, not our artists. We have great artists all over the world. And Rich is in Canada, but a good core of us are in LA. But we never were like consistently. We would. There was a while there that we were working at the offices at Riot, and there was different times where we'd be meeting up more or less. But it was not a huge. I think we were lucky in that way, very lucky in that we were already very adapted to working as a remote studio, and like that was something we was not a hard transition for us at all.
So there was the blinking mechanic, and then there was also this mechanic of choice and branching. And I'd be really curious, when, where, and how you decided to add some of those choices, and why, and what the design was there.
Yeah, I mean, that's been that was like a big part of the conversation all through, is like how much of that. The first script that I wrote, once we had that investment, I wrote the first full script. It had a lot more variability in it. It actually, I'm trying not to go into spoiler territory because we're still on this side of the fence, but it'd be easier to describe after that. But I think that it basically had. It was always going to have a very clear narrative to it and a very clear arc, but there was going to be more wide, very different ways that you could kind of get to the same endpoint. And I had written out, these kind of three very different ways to basically get through the story, or this one section of the story was going to be very modular and variable. And we were starting production on all three of those things. And it was only in, few months in, we kind of were like, oh man, like we can try to do these, these three things, these three different kind of really distinct branches, and do them all kind of halfway, or we can really, really double down and really have that time to polish and pace on one version of it. And we all kind of just, the team, helped me take a look in the mirror, even though, for me, it was hard to let go of, because, as I said, I'm excited by this medium and what it can do that, other storytelling mediums can't. And obviously branching is one of those big things. And I felt like I'd found a really elegant way to branch the story in a way that could still maintain that concise narrative. But it turned out that, we just didn't have the space for it. And then I found that cutting those other branches actually ended up really strengthening the story, because it did end up really focusing the story. It ended up just streamlining everything. And it was a really good cut. It was a really good thing for us to do. So then we had a version of it that was basically, it went from have a lot more branching to basically being completely linear. And it wasn't until Skybound signed on and we were able to have a little more funds that we were going, okay, we have this linear version that's really, really working. But we still have always wanted this to have more choice and just more player expression. And so players can feel like they're owning the narrative in a larger way. And then we actually kind of reverse engineered this linear version and brought some choices back into it, and found some places to build out little branches again, not to the kind of degree that I had initially planned it out, but something that was kind of a halfway. And I think that we landed in a spot that we're really happy with. But it was definitely that push and pull.
Yeah, I mean, you're making like memories come back, but I remember we kind of like kept this flame alive, like even though like we had that realistic sort of realization of, yeah, we're not going to be able to do this branching that Graham had written out. We had kept a flame alive to it through like little comments on the script and the docs and stuff of, oh, this could be a place where there's like a little light branch. And lo and behold, once we did get that injection of more resources, we thought, oh, okay, yeah, we can actually do some of these things. And I think it definitely taught us how subtle branches or small, like light branches can still be really, really impactful if they're written well and if they feel meaningful. And we saw, we got to have this amazing experience of watching a lot of streamers play the game. And we were really, really happy to see that those little branches like meant so much to people.
Yeah,
I know
totally.
On my second playthrough, I specifically made sure to try and do the opposite of a lot of the things I did the first time, just to sort of push at the edges. And I think you're right. There were meaningful differences, and I felt bad making some of the choices that I made. But I wanted to know. I wanted to know what it was like. I remember doing, the first time through. I don't think it's too spoilery. I rejected all things like related to music school, and I answered the phone and went camping. And the second time through, I was like, let me see what happens if I'm like the dutiful son, and I practice, and I don't see her. And so it was interesting to see like you were saying, the way that things do deviate, but then they came back in a way that it felt natural to me, like it worked. Although and I guess I can wait till after we put up the spoiler barrier. I do have one question about the music school, but it can wait.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, that's really good to hear. And we were always trying to find places where you could do those branches that kind of worked with production as well. Because again, indie game, not a huge amount of money of our team, so everything had to be very careful in our choices. So like, one of them is like you can choose to sign with an art agent or not. Basically, like, because of the way that we designed the game, like even in one case where you go out to dinner and either you're out to dinner with your mom or you're out to dinner with your old art school professor. And we were able to actually use the exact same mocap data and just throw on different characters, especially in our low poly style. And then, I just had to write to the mocap data for the alternate branch and stuff like that, of just like finding things. And again, designing scenes where a character's off screen so that you don't have to animate a whole different thing. But if it's a message on an answering machine, you just throw in a different VO file. So it was always about finding these places where it's like, yeah, that can have a huge impact on the player, but it's not going to have a huge impact on production. We definitely learned how to do those things.
Well, it's really interesting. Very cool stuff. All right. I do want to start talking about spoiler territory. So I guess this is where we'd warn the people that are listening, or at least encourage them to go and play the game before we move on. So I think that I've now given sufficient warning for people to pause or wait. And so now we can dive in. I'll start with something that's like probably a little safe, just to make sure. I'm curious about how the story sort of began. Like, did you have specific sources of inspiration? Did you draw from real world experiences, other forms of entertainment? Were there games, films, TV, books, what have you? Like, where did it come from?
Yeah, totally. I mean, again, we had so many kind of bites at the apple. Early on, I think we were bringing on, those more kind of, I remember early on kind of Death of a Salesman was something that I always kept going back to because I was like studying that in school, and the way that that's kind of, in one timeline, and then we keep flashing back. And it's like this kind of take on the afterlife. I remember Will talking a lot about that movie by Tarsem, The Fall. That was a big influence for him. The kind of like unreliable narrator stuff. So we had a lot of influences, as I said, like, we're coming out of, we're big like film nerds and stuff. But I do think that once we had that money, it was sort of like we had tried so many versions of it that were maybe, so much about the kind of different film influences and trying to do these different things that we loved. But once it kind of took that many iterations to realize that I think the final iteration of the script was the first time that, I was trying to pull on more personal stuff. I had struggled with some chronic illness and had to have a major surgery when I was younger, and dealt with some illness in my youth. And I think that stuff was kind of swirling around in my head. And for all of us, it was also all of us, we all grew up in like the same kind of area. Like, as I said, I've known Ollie since I was 3, known Will since 13. Like, we had a lot of shared stuff in our childhood. So like that, on that next iteration, when we said, okay, let's get much more personal with this. And we even took this process of all going back to our old home movies and digitizing some of those. And we would go hang out and like watch old family VHSs of each other's families. And we would spend a lot of time, at Ollie's house, which like kind of I grew up around, we all grew up around. We ended up actually using that as the kind of model, like we kind of modeled it over Ollie's house. And so, yeah, it was actually kind of like still obviously having all those films and all that reference in there, but actually trying to get a little bit more like, no, let's make our version of the game. I think definitely really helped unlock it. And it was the first time I think that we ended up with something that didn't feel like it was, pretentious film kids trying to do this kind of cool thing, and more like something that just came a little bit more from the heart. And I think that, that was a big lesson for us.
I think like there was in the initial iterations, there was that notion of something about time passing, but it really needed like sub themes to manifest it and really specify it. And I think that kind of turn that we took, and Graham very much took sort of to the personal, unlocked those about careerism and expectations and self-acceptance and things like that. And then it started to click and started to rev, like just reading through the script of like, okay, this knows how it is approaching this question of time passing.
So now I want to talk about the huge reveal, because it changes everything. And I'm curious if that was always planned, or is that something that came later? I mean, it's a really transformative moment when you realize it's all been a lie. And then the experience itself like changes so radically. And I just want to know like where that came from.
And when I think a lot of things were floating around in our heads. I was spending a lot of time watching movies like afterlife stories and reading afterlife stories during that time. I think it was in a conversation with Ollie. There's also this, I'm just now remembering, it just like came to mind, but there's this old British movie called A Matter of Life and Death by like the Powell and Pressburger, like these it's like this beautiful Technicolor Ealing British studio film, but it has like a sort of a lawyer who's representing someone after they've died and then sort of making an accounting of their lives. And so that was sort of in my head, this idea of this kind of, we always wanted this character of this ferryman who was sort of and I think that movie and certain things kind of unlocked this idea of sort of somebody who has to represent you to prove that your soul is worthy, and that idea of worthiness. And I don't know if then also thinking about the personal stuffs in my life, that struggle, and how being sick at that age, it's like that's an age, especially middle school coming into high school, where you're so being asked to think about your future. Your whole life is really in service. At that time, it's all about your future. and there's so little, respect given to just all the, the emotions of the present. It's so much about how are you setting yourself up to get to college, to get a career. Yeah, and I think that suddenly I remember it just all dawning on me, this idea of like, wow, what about, a kid who turns out doesn't have that future, and how that puts into question all of the kind of themes that we were playing with, because it was always about, is life about celebrating, what you have and the moment that you're living in, or is it about working towards this abstract future of greatness that you're going to achieve? And thinking about, illness and this really, tragic subject, but realizing that it wasn't, that's it, and it was almost, once I had the idea, there was almost, I remember this fear. I remember calling you all in and being like, I don't want us to do the sick kid thing. It's so, it can be so manipulative, but realizing that it really did unlock, in this very natural way, so much of the questions that we were, as Ollie said, we were always trying to get after, but we never really found a natural way into it. So I think I went off and wrote a really quick little 4-page version of it, like a little fable, basically. And I sent that to Will and Ollie, and they were both like, yeah, this made me choke up. Like, so there's something here. And so, yeah, it was really it all just clicked, and and that happened really early on. Once we had that, after some, that wasn't in any of the other versions, but I'm talking about once we had that Riot investment, I had that time to work. We spent a month talking about different things, watching movies, looking at stuff, talking. We'd have meetings and talk in circles, and then suddenly that just clicked. I think it was in a conversation with you, Ollie, that it clicked, and then suddenly we just all went, "Yep, that's a structure. We can build a story on that."
It really screwed us up, because now I have this sense that on every project there's this huge aha moment, and I know that's not really true, but that was it for us. And Graham sent over this I think it was 1 page front and back fable, and we were like, this is it. So that was nice.
Yeah, it was the idea of somebody lying to in the afterlife, someone trying to lie to this St. Peter at the gate kind of figure, and then realizing that they're not lying because they did something terrible. They're lying because they have misunderstood what greatness is. I think there was something in a C.S. Lewis book called The Great Divorce, which is this sort of his. He writes about the afterlife, but it's this idea of what greatness is on our world is about achievement. So it's this angel, and there's this great procession in heaven, and the person that's with this angel says, "Oh, that must have been some great person, some war general or someone," because they have this great procession following them. And the angel answers, "No, actually, she was just this local woman who took care of local cats, and was this poor woman who died in obscurity. And you don't understand what greatness is up here is not what it is greatness is down there." And that, I think that idea was just so powerful to us, this idea that a character who's misunderstood what a life is supposed to contain, and thinks they need to lie, when in fact they're, they were great in the eyes of this sort of cosmic being.
It was very powerful. I'm glad it's in there. It changes so much of the experience and elevates so much of it. And I'm curious, it also has an impact, at least, or I perceived it had an impact on just the mechanics of the game as well, right? Everything gets subverted a little bit, the way the blinks work, or the way they don't, the things that you wind up doing, the things that you could blink away from at the beginning of the game, that you then can't. And I am still upset, I will say, about Ernie's children. Although at least Ernie showing back up sort of made it okay. But as a cat person, that was
yeah.
But it was also really interesting to have those moments of the game making me face those things.
That was sort of what we realized was our perfect boss level, was okay, we've made this game where it's always just, if you blink, you just jump forward and you don't have to replay it. And there was oh, that would be so fun to do a section where just one little section where you are being forced to if you miss it, you have to go back and watch it. And that lined up so perfectly with a narrative of this kind of interrogation of like, no, you have to show me that thing. So that was just kind of a lucky
I mean, I
thing
think
where we realized
there was that excitement, I think, from an early stage about showing kind of mundanity. And that was something I think we love films that do that. But we also, there was this interest, I think, in the script that you wrote, Graham, about repressed memories as well, and what it is that maybe you forget intentionally. So we wanted a small part of the game to look at that.
and with the Ernie thing, I think for us, I remember when we were going, who's this personification of death going to be? And then we all had these memories of growing up in LA. Coyotes are such a big problem, and you either had a friend or you had a pet that got killed by coyotes if you were a kid growing up in LA. So for us, always wanting to make this afterlife be kind of designed on Benny's psychology, the character. It's like, what's a symbol of death that a child might have? What's for us, maybe some of the earliest experiences with death were the terror of, holy shit, we left the cat outside. Where's the cat? Where's the cat? And then going and finding them out and just what a traumatic thing that is. But it was something we all kind of shared. It's something, if you grew up in the West Coast of California, you might have that experience. So
I will tell you, I grew up in LA, and Samantha was our cat, and she was coyote food. So
there you go.
It's really true.
You know it.
Yeah.
You heard it here.
Yeah. My cats are not allowed outside under any circumstances for exactly those reasons.
Yes. So, it is a traumatic experience.
And then just related to all of that, right? It's a heavy game. It's difficult themes. What's it like to work on something for so long that's so personal and emotional? Like, I don't know, were there times that you were overwhelmed or times you felt you were getting desensitized? Like, what's it like?
Yeah, I mean, both of those for sure. It kind of comes in waves. I remember sitting in the recording session, Sarah Burns, who plays Elle, the mother, giving her performance during a scene where she's very panicked. And that for me was like really hard to listen to. And still, anytime I play that scene or watch someone play that scene, like that audio is a bit much for me. And I think that there were times where people on the team had to like pause or step away from whatever prefab they were working in and go somewhere else, because there are like really difficult parts. And that was something we had a lot of concern about too, of just like, how are people going to handle this at times, because we were going to intense places. But I feel like that was pulled off really well, and people appreciate it for what it is. But yeah, you lose your objectivity, and then you have to watch someone play it and see and hear about it through them. Graham, add something to that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, it is weird how quickly you get desensitized, and Ollie makes a great point that it is because you just work on it for so long. You put in temp audio. Just with you most of the time, it would be like us or our friends, and so it's very hard to have any emotional relationship to it. And then there are those points, like the big points are once you get to the actual actors in. We had an amazing cast, and you suddenly go, oh whoa, you kind of forget. There's all these like moments where you're reminded. And the other point is the music, which Ollie obviously did such an amazing job with. That was really the moment, you get that full audio and the performances in there, and then suddenly you're like, oh wow, this is emotional. And then when the music comes in, then suddenly it kind of, you really are reminded, because you spend so much time with these things, especially when you're in a small studio. You're your own testers, so for I think before that final VO in music, you're at the point where it really is just shapes and colors and sounds and problems. And you don't think about what it means at a certain point. You're just literally just like, it's just work. But yeah, there are those moments where it comes back to you and it can kind of hit you all at once.
Now it's the opposite for me, now that we're like a year out. And we went through a time where we were just like watching streamers back to back. We're like, oh, whoa, people are playing the game. But now that it's a year out, it's like sometimes I'll go a long time without experiencing the game firsthand at all. Like obviously there's still work being done, but actually it's not like we play test or anything like that. So now when I go back to it, it's almost triggering because it reminds me of just how intense the development process was, and you kind of get a flashback of when you were doing this stuff, and now it's triggering in that way, and that's how I'm sensitive to it.
I
Thinking
am
about
curious.
some of those bugs.
Yeah, and just like how we really grew up during it, and like Graham said, we were really just friends, and then it was an intense process kind of growing up and learning how to do all the game dev stuff throughout it. And so yeah, you see a certain thing and you remember a certain day or night working on it.
So it leads me, we've talked a lot about, what went into it and the process to building it. I'd like to know what it was like releasing it, especially now that you can look back and celebrate all of the like nominations and the awards, and congrats on the BAFTA. Like, it's well deserved.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So yeah, what was it like? I'm so curious, from the day you sort of set it out into the world until, I guess, now a little bit more than a year later.
Yeah, I mean, first thing I'll say, because I feel like there's so much to say on this, is like, Graham wrote a very vulnerable kind of story, and very, he drew on a lot of personal experience, and immediately hearing people sort of be grateful for it and then build on it and share their experiences of saying, okay, well, this was really important for me for X, Y, and Z reasons. Like, that was very quickly that happened, and that was sort of the best prize that we could ask for, kind of a thing. So that was amazing. And then, when we shipped the game, I think it was like 5 a.m. in LA. And we just sort of went on Twitch, and someone was playing in England. And then after that, it's like, well, no, wait, now someone else is playing it over in New York. And that was sort of really amazing, because we were still indie, and we didn't get to test the game on a really robust level. So a lot of things we were seeing for the first time in the way that people would engage, especially with streamers, because they talk about their experience, and then you get to see a really big streamer, like, some of the top ones do it, and they're interacting with their chat, and you get to see the chat kind of talk about how they're perceiving things. So that was kind of a little bit of a fun thing for us post launch.
Yeah. I mean, watching the Twitch became a kind of an addiction for the whole team, because it was like we didn't expect it to. You just don't know, right? And yeah, we all gathered. We would all just watch streams, and it was just seeing people. I mean, there was a lot of tension at first when you're watching these streams, because it was like, are they going to get through it? Are they going to hit some progression blocker? Every so often that would happen, and we rushed out a patch, and that was actually really useful for that reason. But most of the time, just seeing them get through it, and so many people crying, and like it was super cathartic. And I remember we all gathered at Ollie's house and projected a stream, and we were like watching someone in Japan play it, and just like drinking and celebrating and watching projected against his house. And that was like, there's something so cool about. We didn't know that, like, when you release a game, that you get to have this like really close, you can really watch people experiencing it in a really intense way. Like, obviously you could go watch your movie in a theater, but you literally are like up on their face seeing how moments are hitting them, and they're literally talking through their reactions. It taught us so much. It's like we didn't know really what we had made, and that's what's so cool about games, is that like they are made when the player plays them, in a way. It's like you've kind of put, you've designed the Rube Goldberg, and then now but they have to actually, you need that player. Like, literally, it is nothing without the player playing it. And especially when you've been playing it yourself and you know it so well, you're not even really a player. You're some other thing. You're not actually experiencing it. And so watching people take that ride for the first time and being able to see it and you learn so much. It really did teach us. It taught me like what games are. It was like, especially the games we make. I just remember realizing, this is like an improv game. It's like this is about how it's dialoguing with the player, and like that the meaning is being created by the player and their reaction. So that was so cool to watch.
Yeah, I mean, it's also such a drug just shipping a game. And I think one of the hardest things about game dev is that it takes really long, and it's kind of like sad to tell someone, oh yeah, I'm starting another game, like I'll see you in a couple of years. Like it's a tough part about it. But when you do put it out there and it goes relatively smoothly, like it is very intense, that feeling. And then we still get people writing us letters and just sharing like really, really personal stories. And those are just, for us, I think that makes it all worth it.
And we were shocked, obviously, by, again, we had, we started to know that we were making something that was probably pretty good, or that we thought, we were proud of it by the end, but we had
Yeah.
so many years where it was like, oh, are we going to just be one of those failed Kickstarters? That, like, I think our expectations were pretty low. For us, it was always like the dream was just getting a game out the door. And just having shipped, really, because again, we had so many years where just doing that seemed like it was going to be an impossibility, shipping anything of any quality. So when it came to, like, the reviews being what they were, just being reviewed at all by major publications, like, as a lifelong reader of Polygon and IGN and games, it's like, I every day checking those sites since I was in middle school. And that was and then coming to these award shows, like, to DICE and the Game Awards, and we were at the GDCAs, and then ultimately the BAFTAs. It's still been, it's still processing it a little bit, because it's not something it was not in our, we weren't expecting it. We really were not expecting it. So we're just super grateful.
Well, like I said, I think all of the accolades and all the love are well deserved. You made something really special, really different, and I don't know, really, yeah. I don't know. I'm glad it exists, and I'm glad that we had a chance to talk, because, like I was saying, I've been a big fan of the project, clearly a big fan of yours. Are you allowed to talk about what might be next for Goodbye World, or is that still TBD, or is it confidential, or is, like, and it's fine. There's nothing you can say.
There's actually,
but I have to ask.
Yeah, it's mostly. I don't think we're going to get too deep into. We're still kind of figuring it out, and the details are still out. I think that there's actually two projects that are going to be starting up. Will's starting something really, really exciting that we're also helping on, and then we're also pushing ahead with another project that is more of a close follow-up to Before Your Eyes. In no way a sequel, but continuing to explore eye tracking. And storytelling in some really unique ways. I think that's as far as we'll probably go. But we are continuing to, we feel we took this big, risk that we never knew how it was going to work out. With we always thought it was really cool. We didn't know what the grander market was going to think about making a game around Blink, and it felt like to us, like, we've been so happy that we feel like all through we were always like, well, you could do this with eye tracking, you could do this with eye tracking, and we'd always go, wait, that's for another game. Keep it into this. So as soon as it came to this moment, we can make another game, we were like, there's so many exciting ways to utilize this tech to tell emotional stories. So that's kind of where we're heading next.
I am curious, with the sort of removal of traditional control schemes, did you find that there were people that were engaging with the experience that may not traditionally be video game players, because it's easier to engage with from a mechanical perspective?
Yeah, that was always the goal. And I think a little bit, Ollie, definitely something as we designed it that we always wanted it to be a game that can be played by anyone. And we think it really is a game that can be played by anyone.
Yeah, I think there's a two-pronged answer there. One is that there's a question of kind of physical accessibility, which I think this Before Your Eyes is kind of like a tip of the iceberg sort of thing, where and there's a lot of people out there doing things with alternative controllers, people doing it like in their rooms, and then of course like some of the platforms and bigger first parties are pursuing that as well. And I think there's so much to be done there. I think what we've done is sort of shown how you can make a good game when you start there, as opposed to mapping it on retroactively. But there's a lot more to be done. And I think that, for us, we hope that people see this as a sort of an indication that there's a lot that can be done with alternative controller inputs. And then I think there's also a question of sort of I don't want to say non-skill based, but yeah, like the kind of games we're interested in, even going back to like when we were in high school playing games, like we were excited to get a friend who was a non-gamer and have them play Journey or Limbo, because that was fun for us. And I think we're now trying to do that ourselves. And like we saw that online too, where you'd have people playing the game who were like really good Twitch like FPS players, and they would be just as good or bad at playing this game as somebody who, it was their first stream playing a game, because it's the newness that is the only challenge. There's nothing about skill that's there. And for us, like that's something we're passionate about.
I mean, I think I think everyone could enjoy interactivity, right? I think that like that doesn't seem like a disputable fact. It's just that, you know, the greatest interactive storytelling is often tied to game literacy. And so only people who are literate, you know, and know how to play games and are active gamers can access this other thing that you don't, you know, which is like the great storytelling and like the games, you know, like the AAA games you're working on, that like great games that are inspiration. But going like, it's so interesting how a lot of that great stuff is hidden behind, you know, can only be accessed if you know how to move in first person space, or you know how to, you know, run around and jump on things. And so, yeah, I mean, for us, we really hope, because it's like, there's no doubt that anybody can enjoy interactive media, whether or not they want to, you know, play a skill-based game. And it's just a matter of how do you get that in front of those people. And that's going to be really, we hope that there's some signs and some things that are coming up for before your eyes that show that maybe there's a chance that that's going to start to change. There's going to be more avenues to get that to them. It's like we wish more non-gamers were playing it. I think because right now it's just on PC and Mac. You need to have you probably want a Steam account. It's more like maybe if a gamer shows a non-gamer, it's like, and then they'll have a great time. So I think going forward, I really do hope that there are more avenues for people who don't play games to find experiences like ours, or the kinds of games that don't have that barrier to entry.
We also just like that. I think we enjoy that type of interaction more and more. It's sort of like interesting to us. And even if the next generation is like every single person in the world is a very proficient FPS player, which it seems like that might be the case, we're still going to, I think, make this kind of stuff because for us, it's fun.
Well, that sounds great. And I am very excited to see what comes next as a huge fan of yours. I guess I'm out of questions. Is there anything, I don't know, you want to leave me with that you think I should have asked about that we didn't get a chance to talk about? I at least wanted to give you a chance to share. Okay.
I mean, look, I will say that one of the cool kind of things that this has brought about for us is like getting to meet people who've worked on games that are really important to us, getting to meet people who've been like doing this for a long time and veterans, and we're just like, oh my God, I can't believe we're talking to this person. So it's very cool to be doing this with you right now. We really appreciate it.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you. I feel like you are much cooler and better at this than I've ever been. So I am as excited and impressed. And so thank you for taking the time to chat with me today.
Thank you so much.